So this is the continuation of the workflow video where we can get into server-side stuff. So I've gone ahead and I've cleaned up the application from part one. I've got the inline CSS set up. We can go and glance at this real quickly. So in the UI, I've moved the pet components out to a separate namespace. I've moved the root to here. I've done a CSS include and a style element to get CSS showing. I've added a little icon in here and a delete operation that removes things from the state. Set this up so it autofocus, and that you could hit escape to get out of a field and enter instead of having to blur. So just like I said, some minor cleanups. I also added form state support, and so you can see I can hit escape now, and it remembers the old version. There's actually form data here. This is part of the form state stuff you could look at in the developer's guide. So I've integrated all of that. It's not very much more code, and I've actually already added some server stuff as well, but I'm going to walk you through how the workflow kind of moves from here. So at the moment, if you'll remember, let's go to the cards. What we've done is we're pre-merging some pets on load. So if I reload the cards, I always end up with these same 3 pets. And this is giving me a way of working with this application, the whole application, in fact, in a dev card. And I could very easily move just pieces of this out and use the same sort of thing to continue to have that working properly. Now what I'd like to do is start moving towards server kinds of things. Now in my workflow, I typically, when I do any sort of I/O, I like to have things isolated. And I like to put the I/O as close to the outer layer of the application as possible, test those individual pieces, and then build up from there. And so what I'm going to do is, in the project file, I'm going to add a few libraries, which I've already done. I'm going to add Fulcro SQL, which will give me SQL access, and some extra utilities around that. I'm mainly using it for the utilities. I'm going to add in an H2 database, which this can manage. I'm doing that so that when you play with these files on your own, you don't have to install any database. This one can just, it's a pure Java JVM database that can just run. All this stuff is just to make sure all the logging goes to the same place. And then I'm going to use Fulcro spec to do server-side testing. So I've added those pieces, and then I've added a couple of run configurations. So I've got a regular closure REPL, which actually I'm going to call my server testing REPL. And I'm passing this option here to the JVM. Fulcro spec, if I pass that, it adds some additional abilities to help me make sure that I'm not fooling myself when I write database tests. So I'm going to have that guy. And then I'm going to have another closure REPL that I'm going to use for running the actual production server when I get to that. And I don't want to run these in the same, I might want to run them simultaneously, and I don't want to get confused about which one's which and which JVM needs refreshing, etc. So better to have both. So I'm going to go ahead and start up my server testing REPL. And I don't need the command line here. And then I'm going to, I've already made a database spec here. Show you some bits. All right, so I could start my server tests in the user namespace. When you build a template, you automatically get this server-side test runner, which can render in the browser. And this dev test suite defines a symbol that you can use as a function to start a server on this port that will compile tests in this directory using these source paths. And then you can set tags available for focusing in on tests, and you can default the list of those that shows up when you start the test viewer. So I've added an integration test tag here. I'll show you how that works in a moment. But I've kept it out of the default set. And so that way, when I go to run database tests, if I'm running unit tests, I don't want to wait for the database tests, and I may not want to run the database, etc. So I may not want those turned on by default, which is why the default's not set. to include integration. So like I said, I'll show you those here in a second. So I'm going to run that start server test. You'll see it start, end up with port 8088. Now I can pop into that. And the file name you use here, this is documented in Fulcro spec. This one comes in from the resources of the jar file of Fulcro spec itself. It's that HTML file's pre-built for you. So you just go to that and it brings up your server tests. It runs them, and then it gives you the results. Now, I don't have any of them set to run by default because I don't have integration checked in this menu. And I don't have any other server tests. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the integration tests, and now you'll see a bunch of messages came out over here, and I've got some green lights. So let me show you what this looks like. There's several components to Fulcro SQL, and essentially what I want when I'm doing database development is I want a way to run a test database that gets auto-migrated against database migrations to make sure the scheme is up to date. Gets completely dropped and recreated when I use it, so that I don't have to worry about stale test data. Like I said, it has some migrations, and then I need some connection pool properties. So Fulcro SQL uses Hikari CP for connection pooling. It uses Flyway for migrations, and this is basically, you tell it which driver you're using. In my case, H2. It also works well with Postgres. It's got preliminary MySQL support. Those are the 3 databases it currently has. It's 10 lines of code to add a new driver at the moment. So let me just quickly show you these files. So in config, the migration is just an SQL file that literally just creates a table. And connection pool properties is just an H2 properties thing for Hikari. So I have to tell it the database class name and where I want to put the database on disk. And then in my developer EDN config, I need to add this key for SQL Database Manager, and then I can add any number of databases in here where I give this same config over in the test. I have to have access to this kind of config data, and I might want to put it in a different place. In fact, I'm going to use a different connection pool so that I don't connect to the same database as my development environment uses. So in my development environment, I'm going to use config connection pool properties, and in my test environment, I'm going to use test connection pool properties, which is a different database. So that just helps me separate them. So my dev Eden, which the server loads, remember if you look at the server over here, you can specify the name of the configuration file the server uses. We can set up components, so I can add a database component to my server, which depends on the config, and then I can inject both the config and the databases into my parser so that my queries and mutations can talk directly to those databases. So that's really all there is to the setup. It's several files, but they're all straightforward. Some migration files, you can look at Flyway for the naming of these, connection pool, basic data source stuff, and then a configuration to configure one or more SQL databases with the correct driver, etc. And in development mode, I'm also going to do auto migrate, create, drop, but I could choose different options here. Okay, so that's the basic setup that I've got so far. Let me go back to the spec here. So I give this database config. I've got these connection properties. H2 will create this database if it doesn't exist, and then of course I'm using the configuration option to create drop it every time, so I shouldn't end up with stale data. Now remember, I told you that I set this -D option, and what that does for Fulcro SQL is when you seed a database, it randomly distributes the IDs it generates so that you are encouraged not to embed specific IDs in here, like, oh, I'm pretty sure that's going to be 1, I'm pretty sure that's going to be 2, I'm pretty sure that's going to be 3 in my test output. Well, if you did that, you can get all sorts of weird results, and you can see the actual data that I'm getting back has these IDs spread out kind of in a random amount. So I need to actually see what I got from the database. So let me show you basically how this works. I can set up a test database config. I can use with database, and what it does is it does everything this config says to do. It goes and creates a connection pool, it runs the migrations, it cleans out the database if necessary, and then it gives me back this database spec, which is usable with Java, Clojure Java JDBC, or Fulcro SQL itself. Fulcro SQL comes with this seed function, which you can give it one of these specs. You can give it a schema, which in our case can basically be a nearly empty map. This is for running queries against it. So at the moment I've just got no joins defined, an H2 database, no property transforms, and no primary key transforms. So this configuration file or configuration information that you can read about in Fulcro SQL, it has to do with running graph queries against the database, which we're not going to cover in this video. And so seed can take the database spec, the schema, which it basically just needs for the driver parameter, and then one or more seed rows or seed updates, where you can tell it the table name as a keyword, and then column values. For columns that are the primary key, you can use a keyword to stand in for that. And this can also be used, once you've used one in a primary key location, you can also use that in join data. So you can create quite a complex seeding here, where this pet could a person who owns pets, you could have their list of pets be configured using these IDs in later rows that you seed. This function returns a map from these keywords that you've placed in primary key locations to their actual seeded database ID, the number. And so you can just use the keys destructuring to pull those IDs straight out, and then you can do assertions against it. So what I'm really testing here is that the get pets operation, when I sort it by DB ID, gives me back what I would expect to need for my user interface, right? So I'm calling get pets, I'm calling sort by on the result I get by that of DB ID, and I'm interested in these being the properties that I'd want in my UI, right? If I got the wrong thing there, like if it were just ID and name, my UI wouldn't work properly. And then I'm sorting them just to make sure that my test is consistent. If I don't sort them, then it's possible that some database weirdness would cause tests to fail. Whereas if I've sorted them and the query returns them out of order or something, actually it is gonna. I am relying on the fact that I do get IDs in sequence, but if the generated in sequence, but if the query for some reason, as you well know, databases aren't required to return them in the order they were inserted, so certain databases could spin me around. So I'm trying to make my test a little more robust. And so my get pets function that I'm going to define in my petDB is supposed to return a vector that finds all of the pets in the database. And so here I'm expecting Campertilly and Buddy to be the IDs, which I got from this destructuring, and names to be Campertilly Buddy. So I can write that test, and I can go over here and let's break this for a second, just to show how I did this. So I may have initially wrote this, and JDBC query, when I select those things, gives me back ID and name, not DB ID and pet name. And so then all I did was use to set remap or rename keys to rename the keys to get back what I expect. So this gives me a really quick way of generating an API. And then all I have to do is go over into my read CLJ file and define some query, def query root all pets. I'm going to get an environment here in my def query that's going to include my databases that I injected back here in the server, parser injections databases. I can use getDB spec to ask for the pets database, and then I can run get pets on that. Okay, so let's take a look at the next step. If I go over here into client, I've defined my client for production runtime to load root all pets that are pet components and target them to my pet list pane pets. Right, so this gives me a runtime result dynamically loading from the server. So let me make sure let me switch to build and add my dev build to the things that are being built. And then on my server, I'm currently running the tests. I'm currently not running my regular server. So let's start that up. And of course, in my user CLJ file here, I have the typical things that the template puts out: go, restart, for starting and restarting the server. And so all I have to do here is type go, and I'll get a web server on port 3000. So localhost 3000, I should get my UI, and of course I've got no pets. But you can see if we do that with network tracking on here, you can see that the API request was made. I asked for all pets, and the response back was, well, an empty list, because there aren't any pets in the database yet. All right, so I've got my test workflow where I can build my individual UI pieces. So I can have my spec here where I spell out things. This is, by the way, where you tag the kinds of tests. So if I go back into my testing UI and I uncheck integration tests, but I leave focused checked, then I can actually add that marker on a test to focus it. Actually, start with that. Oh, I have none checked. This is if it has none, they're going to run. So let's uncheck that. Let's make this test fail. And if I add focus to that, then that one shows up. So basically the markers are, if it has at least one of the ones that you're currently running, then you'll get that test. So this is another way of focusing in on it as like a temporary point where you've got one specification. You might have 20 integration tests and you only want to look at one of them, but you don't want to swap that tag out. You want to just focus in on one. Anyway, so that's quick. Okay, so I've got my test, I've got my way of seeding data, I've got something that'll drop and create the database for me in a nice block form. And now I've got my server. My server can respond to a query, but I don't have anything in there yet. So what I can do is go over to this user namespace, make sure it's loaded. So I just hit the keyboard shortcut to load the namespace. And then I'm going to use this get database function I've written, and it's in the user namespace. So this isn't part of my normal production app. It just allows me to look at the running server system, find the databases component, and then ask for the DB spec from that for pets. So that lets me then do some manual seeding on the database. So I just inserted 2 rows into the database. You see I got back a map of the ID Guppers and the ID Cooper of 1 and 2. I don't have -ddev on this particular one, so you see the IDs are just in sequence. So now I should be able to go to my application, reload, and see my 2 pets. So same thing for working from there. I might go to my DB spec and add another component. Maybe I want to honor deleting a pet, which I don't have an operation for yet. So it's not going to return a vector. It removes a pet from the database. And so let's say I'm going to remove Tilly from this one. I've already got the database set up with those initial rows, and let's actually go over and see my failing test here. And so I could just use that existing database. The tests are going to run in order to do my operations, because I've got this way of getting my pets and sorting the rows. So really all I need, let's move that outside to there. is to say something like petDB. And we'll start out without doing anything, just to make sure everything is compiling. Okay, and so this should be something as simple as JDBC execute on the DB, delete from pet where and there we go. Now I've got delete pet. And of course, now I can pop over to my, now that I know that's working right, I can pop it over to my server mutations. And by the way, I've placed my client mutations into this namespace and refactored things to use this namespace in the components UI for those mutation names. So delete pet. We're going to take the ID, and then the action we're going to do, again, we've injected the databases into our environment, and so we should be able to let the database be our SQL get DB spec on databases pets, and then we can use our operation to accomplish that, hopefully. And then all we have to do, of course, on the client mutation is make it full stack. So I should be able to reload that, delete guppers. Oh, have to restart the server. So it's telling me that the server mutate for delete pet wasn't installed, and that's because I didn't restart my server over here. And when I restart the server, I've got drop add, so I need to go back to user, seed my database, try the mutation. Oh, still no go. No value supplied for key 1. Oh. I think this is, yeah, so this is looking for DBID remappings or something, and so I need to actually, this is returning something that makes Fulcro think I'm actually trying to return a value to the client. So again, I could probably set that up to automate for my development environment. All right, I got a good API response. Now if I reload, I should see just one pet. Okay, so my delete is working. So that's the basic workflow for moving towards full stack. Get yourself some tests going, test your I/O, get the server integrated with some sort of back-end storage system. And of course, I still have my dev card over here using literal data that's coming from something I just configured into the card. So this gives me the ability to continue to work on it in an abstract sense without needing any database, but then also to go ahead and evolve and try out the real application as a standalone.